Salve, hi. In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the serial and oral method, which is the method that we are using in this course to learn Latin. The method was invented by Jean Manesca, and it dates back to the late 1700s, early 1800s. It took him about 30 years to develop the system. And essentially, what the system is a natural method which distributes and classifies the parts of language. And the idea is that the information is presented in an order that can be more easily assimilated, so that even if someone isn't particularly brilliant intellectually, they can still acquire the language. Whereas much traditional language learning, being heavily grammar-based, certainly skews the playing field towards those with a more mathematical type of mind. Whereas, as we can see out in the real world, most people can speak language, can use language, but may not necessarily be able to analyze it. Most Latin courses are not actually about teaching the language per se, they are about analyzing it. And that's a different thing completely. Being able to analyze a language effectively doesn't make you into a good user of that language or a good practitioner of that language. And obviously having some grammatical knowledge is useful and helpful, but we don't need it completely. Our brains are able to produce an enormous amount of generalization, and our brains are able to pick up rules pretty much by themselves. For example, this recent bit of research, one moment, I'll pull it up. Have it. This bit of research was published in April 2011, so very recently, in the Linguistic Society of America journal Language. And what it shows is that language learning isn't only about imitation, but that those people who learn are able to generalize rules and learn the restrictions that apply to the rules, even when they're not taught the rules explicitly. So you learn not what to say. For example, an artificial word, hablem, was made up, and it was then put in a situation where people knew it was a modifier of a noun, an adjective. And what was found is that users using this word were avoiding putting it in front of the noun it was modifying. They were not saying an hablem cat. They were saying the cat that's hablem. And what seems to be happening here is that the word was being generalized, because there are other words in English that sound a bit like hablem, like, for example, afraid. We don't say the afraid cat. We say the cat that's afraid. And that's the rule for that kind of modifier. And so what was happening is that speakers were generalizing the made-up word. What was also happening was that when it was put after the noun in contexts where it was quite clear that this wasn't natural language use, the brain didn't acquire the generalization. And the researchers likened this to watching somebody playing a video game with their right hand in a plaster cast. And of course, a child watching this isn't going to make the generalization that you have to play video games with your left hand. They will assume that if the person's right hand was free, they could play. So the brain was only making its connections when the word was being used in a natural, unrestricted fashion. So what this research shows is that learning isn't purely through imitation, but your brain is actually being highly creative and acquiring patterns while you are listening. Now, of course, language learning is a bit different. You don't really have all the data. So an enormous amount of repetition is needed to build up the data set inside your brain so you can make the generalizations. This is the basis, to some degree, of Manesca's method. We'll return to that now. Manesca's method is called the serial and oral method. It's called the serial method because the elements of language teaching are distributed and they are classified in a logical series. Now, the idea, Manesca's idea, was this would be a sort of natural progression, And he designed his series specifically for the French language, and he said, well, any other language you teach, you would need to readjust the series, the order in which things are presented. And the elements, for example, are verbs, moods, tenses, pronouns, parts of speech, idioms, and these are each arranged in place, and they form a great chain of interconnected and dependent links. And this slowly builds up. So we start off with a very limited amount of information and slowly increase it. And so by this serial arrangement, the idea is that you, the student, are led on from simpler parts of a language to more complex parts of a language. And you acquire this without an enormous amount of labor. And because the system isn't an artificial system but a natural system, your brain can engage in the task simply through exposure to the linguistic data set. Now, the unique part of Manesca's system was that it was oral. And it was oral in the time period before language laboratories and before tape recorders, so it was quite an onerous job for the teacher to implement it. And I think this is one reason why it never became very successful. Whereas with YouTube, I can present the lessons and I've only got to teach them once, because an enormous amount of repetition is indicated by this method. So the oral method, of course, teaches knowledge of the spoken language. And these oral exercises have been prepared and they are introduced for the purpose of communicating oral skill in the language. Manesca's idea, his basic idea, was that this system would sort of follow the natural language acquisition system of a child, and he sort of observed children quite closely and took notes of how their language skill developed and what kind of things were being said at the beginning. And he tried to model this on natural language growth to the degree that he was able to observe it. Very similar to the method that a mother would use when talking to their child in their mother tongue, but of course structured and adapted for students who are of a more mature age. So the whole process is condensed. It is greatly abridged and concentrated into a much shorter span of time. It takes a small child several years to acquire language that an adult can acquire in relatively shorter time through studying a structured method. Now, what is of crucial interest in this method is Manesca was insistent that in each progressive step, only one new element would be introduced. That would be one new construction, or one new idiom, or one mood, or one tense. And it's presented at the same time to the student. And it's first practiced upon with simple elements, which are very well known. So every exercise goes back to the first principles and reviews very simple material that's already known. And then very, very quickly through the exercise, we review and advance to the material as we go through. So of course the exercises do get longer and longer as the course progresses. The idea being that every single new element of linguistic knowledge requires quite substantial mental effort. Your brain has to work out how to structure it, where it fits in with the existing knowledge that you have. And the idea is to limit the amount of new information so that only one mental effort is required of a student at any one time. And now Manesca says something very interesting. He says that to impress the elements on the mind, as many of the senses as possible should be engaged. So the burden of acquisition isn't thrown completely on the memory. As I said, traditional Latin teaching is heavily grammar oriented and it's heavily memory oriented. There isn't an enormous amount of material, of text, of exposure to Latin text in most Latin textbooks. Even very good ones like the Cambridge Latin course in my view, do not have sufficient material for students to read. There should be far, far more examples, far more material covering the ground. So to go back to this idea of using all of the senses, firstly, the sense of hearing is engaged in the oral exercises. The sense of sight, of seeing the letters, is engaged in the reading exercises if you're actually going to look at the text. And then sight and touch are combined in writing. Now this is a very interesting observation. There's been another bit of research produced, and I'm going to just flip and find that now and pull it up for you. One moment. Now the bit of research I've just pulled up is a piece of research by Professor Anne Mangan at the University of Stavanger at the Reading Centre. And this bit of research was examining whether students who were typing information on a keyboard or students who were writing it out using their hand were the same, whether they were getting the same information into their heads. Now, of course, the process of reading and writing, as Manesca pointed out, involves sight, it involves touch, and involves kinesthetic movement. Your arm is moving. So there are a number of senses involved when you write by hand, and this is all feeding back into your brain from our motor actions, together with the sensation of the fingers touching the pencil, the feel of the paper. And this is there's a lot more feedback here than there is when we're simply touching a keyboard. And so the research was done with a neurophysiologist, and they examined a large amount of research that confirmed that pretty much those students or those tasks that were carried out by hand were producing more, what's the word I want? More stickiness, I suppose. The information was building up in a clearer pattern in the brain than simply those tasks that were carried out with the keyboard. Anyway, in this experiment, what was done by this particular research team was to find out which parts of the brain were activated when we read letters, which we've learned by handwriting, and also which parts of the brain are activated simply when we are recognizing letters that we've learned through typing on a keyboard. Because when we're writing by hand, then that involves a motor memory, it involves a sensory-motor part of the brain, which is a different part of the brain, and that helps us recognize the letters themselves. And so this implies a connection between reading and writing, which is not so strange. And it suggests, the researchers thought that this sensory motor, this feeling and movement connection, was involved in visual recognition and reading. And the experiments showed that a certain part of the brain, called Broca's area, was much more active when reading something that is associated with physical activity compared to reading, say, a verb that's to do with running, walking, or reading a verb that's not associated with an action, like dying. And also, this is associated when you simply observe somebody doing something. You don't have to do anything yourself. This is why watching me speak Latin is actually quite useful. Because simply hearing about or watching an activity is enough, because your brain is able to model it through watching, through mirroring. And what these researchers noted was that there's actually been a lot of research in the computer gaming field and in various educational fields that are using, where computers are being used to teach with haptics. Haptics is about touch. For example, computer game consoles, the hand controls which vibrate and start to move to provide sensory feedback. Vibrating hand controls to train dentists how to use dental drills, virtual drills. They've got sound and they've got vibration. But what these researchers pointed out was actually very little research has been done that includes haptics, that's sensory motor information, connected to the educational acquisition of information through knows about reading and writing, whether touch is actually important, whether movement is important. So in the experiment they devised, they made up an alphabet, one that no one had seen before, and they involved two groups of adults. One of them had to write out this alphabet to learn it, and the other one had to simply type it on the keyboard. And they were taught to type using this alphabet on the keyboard, and the other group were taught to write it using pen and paper. And those who learned how to write it using pen and paper came out ahead in all of the tests. Subsequently to this first testing, they then did the MRI scans, and they showed that those who were writing, when they were writing using this new alphabet, the Broca's area of the brain was being activated, whereas those who were typing, there was little or no activation of the Broca's area. Now let's go back to Manesca, writing in the very early 1800s. This is what he says: the writing of phrases, which employs the sense of touch as well as the sense of sight, and which concentrates attention strongly, is one of the most efficient methods of impressing language on the memory. And now we know why. Because Broca's area in the brain is being activated when we are doing sensori-motor activity. As the other two senses cannot be employed, that's taste, smell, in the study of language, all the material avenues to the mind, which can be enlisted in the work, are resorted to by the present method. It's very interesting because, for example, neuro-linguistic programming, this area of psychology developed by Bandler and Grinder, also greatly focuses on the different sensory inputs and their great importance in learning, memory, etc. A second part of Manesca's method is the intellectual analytical aspect of the method, and what he calls the intellectual faculties. And the first of these is analysis, in that the elements of language are very carefully, or have been very carefully, analyzed, and each element is presented singly and clearly to the mind. And the position and the value of each element is explained, and through all of the examples, its relation to the other elements is then understood. And this then enables the learner to use the element pretty much without hesitation in a variety of combinations. The second faculty addressed is what he calls the association of ideas. Every linguistic element is associated in innumerable ways with other elements. Now, we can't cover all of these in the course, but we can be quite extensive. And thus, they are made to support each other, and they support each other mutually by association, and then they help with their retention. And the third logical faculty is what he calls the synthetic faculty, that of combination of ideas, so that as many facts or principles as possible in all cases are grouped together under one topic, and they are presented to the mind as a single linguistic fact or principle. And this greatly shortens the labor of learning. Generalizations have been made throughout the work of teaching, and they've been made with very great care. And this is intended to simplify the acquisition of the language. So the moods and tenses, for example, are simplified so that, for example, he's talking about the way he teaches French here. By learning the infinitive mood and the second person plural of the present indicative, you then acquire all the other modes and tenses with little difficulty. And the verbs are classified, and the derivation of moods and tenses, etc., have been adapted to the method. And this applies to the Latin method as well, that the order in which material is taught is changed from the usual order in which is taught in many grammar books. Now, Jean Manesca, the inventor of this oral method, was born in 1774 in the island of Saint Domingo, and he had to flee from there because of political uprisings, and he came to America. And he'd lost all his wealth. The family had been extremely wealthy in Santo Domingo, and he started to teach languages. And this is pretty much what he devoted his life to, the scientific study of language teaching. As we can see from what little we've covered of the ideas behind his method, he was an extremely original thinker. Some called him a genius, and he may well have been, certainly within this area, because of the originality of his thought, his ability to look at the way language should be taught, come up with a method which hadn't been used before explicitly. There certainly is an element of genius in that. Manesca worked on his method for about 20 years, perfecting it, teaching it, developing it, before he finally published. And he published in 1835, and he died in 1837. So he only published really towards the end of his life. His goal wasn't to publish a textbook, he wanted to preserve his method. The relationship between Jean Manesca's method and Adler's method is this, because they have a direct historical relation to each other. Jean Manesca taught a student called Albert Brisbane, who studied with Jean Manesca in 1825, and Brisbane kept copious exercise books in which the entire method as taught by Manesca was written down. And he went off and studied in Paris, and he engaged a Mr. Henri Ollendorff in Paris to teach him German, and he showed Henri Ollendorff the French lessons he'd had that were given to him by Jean Manesca, and he asked Mr. Ollendorff to teach him German using the same methodology, which Mr. Ollendorff did. And then what Mr. Ollendorff then went off and did was he devised his own method for teaching German, based pretty much exactly on the method that he had learned from looking at Manesca's notebooks. And so we ended up with the Ollendorff method. Now, the Ollendorff method is not a serial and oral method, although it's structured in a very similar way and it uses the same principles. It's essentially a method for learning the language through translating from English into French or from German into whatever target language. So it's a translation course. Although it can be used as an oral course, it's not structured as that. Adler then produced a updated Latin version of the course. Ollendorff himself had produced a Latin version in the 1840s. This wasn't very good. I have a copy of it. And then Adler rewrote this with grammatical notes, and so we end up with Adler's practical grammar of the Latin language, which is a translation of Ollendorff's version of Jean Manesca's textbook. So they all connect to each other very well. What I've done is I've gone back to Jean Manesca's original method using the material from Adler, and I am readjusting Ollendorff's imperfect implementation of Manesca and giving you the course as closely as possibly as it would have been taught by Jean Manesca himself, to the extent that this is possible. So that explains what we're trying to do here, teaching you Latin through this serial and oral method. Vale, thanks, goodbye.